with your kids.
Hola, niho, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moni wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Tell your kids' teachers, the librarian, their principal. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Today we're very excited to welcome back one of our favorite guest hosts, Jordan Sahley. Hey, Jordan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Reading with Your Kids podcast. Today I am joined by Jade Adia to talk about her upcoming book, There Goes the Neighborhood. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Jordan?
I'm good as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so There Goes the Neighborhood. It's my debut novel that comes out today on March 7th, and it follows three best friends in a fictional neighborhood in South LA who, when one of their friends' families is facing eviction, concocts a really wild and risky plan to start a fake gang online to scare gentrifiers out of their neighborhood in hopes of saving their friend's family from eviction and keeping their neighborhood together. So it's a comedic murder mystery about gentrification and urban politics in cities in America.
That's so fun. What made you decide to write this? What made this your debut novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I wrote the book during the summer of 2020, which I think, we all remember as like a very tumultuous summer with the Black Lives Matter uprisings and just a lot going on. And I had been spending a lot of time going out, going to protests and, being in those spaces. And so part of it was a little bit like it was a stressful time. I really wanted a creative outlet. I had never written a book before that summer, but, it became time where I really felt called to try to do something to take my mind off of things. And then the other side of it was when I was in all of these spaces and going to all of these protests, I was really moved and in a lot of ways inspired by how a lot of the younger protesters, the high schoolers and the Gen Z students who were there, they were bringing a completely new and unique energy to the space where I had never been to a protest where people brought speakers and were playing music and there was dancing and there was a lot of, joy and resistance to what was happening as well. So that made me think like, oh wow, I think I want to try my best at writing young adult and kind of capture that energy of like, dealing with a political theme, but also still centering the joy and the livelihood and like the subversion as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any friends that inspired those main characters for you? Because they're all so funny and entertaining.
I have I didn't want anyone to get mad at me for saying like, oh my God, you wrote me into a book. So I tried to be super careful to have some distance, but there's definitely bits and pieces of a lot of people I love in the book. And even though the book is set in a fictional neighborhood in South LA, I think when I gave early copies of the books to my friends to read, they immediately recognized certain landmarks and Easter eggs stuck in, like, oh, this was this party that we went to in high school, and oh, I remember this place that used to be here. So I think a close reader could maybe tell some things, but I tried to keep it pretty general.
Yeah, I gotcha. You grew up in South LA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What was that like, and how have you seen it change as you've grown up?
Yeah, so I loved where I grew up and that experience that I had as a young person growing up in that part of the city. I think for a lot of people who aren't familiar with South LA, I think they'd be really surprised to learn that it's like a massive geographic area that covers a ton of different neighborhoods. And within that, there's so much diversity, where there's a lot of cultural diversity, language diversity, immigrant status, gender, sexuality. Like you can find any type of person within South LA. And I think for me, like growing up in such like a diverse environment like that was really exciting. And, another part of it as well was that, which I try to kind of convey this aspect of my like experience growing up in the book, is that, for me, I lived in such an interconnected neighborhood where even today now, as an adult all these years later, like my neighborhood still refers to itself as the village, because there was this network of people that were really looking out for one another, where in high school, if there was something that was difficult for my family, then I would have another neighbor pick me up from school, and I would have another neighbor whose house I can walk to and have dinner and sleep over at this person's house. And just having those social safety nets was so important during those formative years for me. And, I gave that, special part of the experience of growing up in South LA to the main character in my book as well, where she gets to benefit from being a part of such a close-knit neighborhood. And, so I'm happy to say that aspect of the neighborhood has stayed the same. But yeah, things have changed a lot. In the book, there are, in some ways, like little memorials to restaurants and businesses that aren't here anymore. And, the demographic has changed. And like a lot of cities, it's gotten so much more expensive. And I've seen friends and families had to leave the neighborhood and get pushed out, which is tough, and also part of the inspiration for writing this story.
For sure. Is that also, I saw that you're a lawyer as well. Is that also like part of the reason you wanted to go into law?
Yeah, so I graduated from law school. I decided to not take the bar. So I'm still unclear if I'm allowed to call myself a lawyer or not, but I did go to law school. And when I was there, I was studying critical race studies. And that wasn't necessarily my focus going into law school. I was actually really focused on youth justice. I had been working in schools before then and in the nonprofit sector, and was just really interested in young people's education, and also how young kids are policed and surveilled in school settings. So that's kind of what brought me to law school. But it's funny how things work, where I kind of went to law school thinking I'd do youth justice, had never once considered writing children's literature. But then by the end of law school, I got my book deal right in the middle of law school, and I graduated heading into writing my second book with Disney, that has strong themes of youth justice in my work. So it's funny how it all sort of works out in the end. But the gentrification stuff was more so an area that I did start exploring once I was in law school more, taking housing justice clinics and whatnot.
Yeah. Everything happens for a reason. Weirdly enough, a lot of the authors who I talked to were also lawyers at one point, and I don't know how that pipeline works.
Yeah, it's a weird thing that happens, but I think it's kind of, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I think for me, part of it was that, law school can be like a pretty restrictive environment sometimes. So I think for me, even though I had a pretty positive experience where I went, it was one of those things where I was like, I felt the creativity in my life really sidelined. And I think that brought out this urge to recenter it. And I think that kind of happens to a lot of people, where if you feel a part of yourself being pushed down, it's like, ooh, let me like bring this back to life. So that might be part of the lawyer to writer pipeline.
Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. Where did you go to law school?
I went to UCLA, which was great to come back home for school.
Gotcha. So are you still living in South LA, or?
Yeah, so I have been living in a different part of LA for the past couple of years, Echo Park, but actually next week, another weird thing how life works, I'm actually moving back to my neighborhood next week where I just found the dream apartment that's walking distance from my mom, my nephews, my best friends, and so I'm actually having a big welcome back to the neighborhood party next weekend after the book comes out.
That's such good timing.
Yeah, it's amazing timing. I couldn't ask for it to be better.
Yeah. Has your family read your book already, I'm guessing?
Yeah, they have. They have.
Do they love it?
Yeah, my mom loves the dedication up front to her. That's her favorite part of the book. But I think, my friends and family, they've all been nothing but incredibly supportive. And I think especially for a lot of my friends, and I have older sisters as well, who we all had similar experiences where no matter what age you were, there was kind of a band of other kids in your grade who you'd be able to run around with. So I think all of us know, especially now as adults, how incredibly special that experience was, especially in a city as big as LA, where a lot of people can feel lost, that we had this really supportive, safe, and nurturing environment where we got to just be happy Black kids running around our neighborhood. So I'm really happy that they've all been rooting for me and they've loved the book and been nothing but supportive.
That is awesome. So in your book, you talk about a lot of big topics, and I know the American education system doesn't talk about them as much for kids growing up. So I was just wondering, do you think that this book could be a good jumping off point for kids who don't know as much about these topics?
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, well, one of the ways that I did kind of get to merge writing and law school when I was still there was I did an independent study that allowed me to spend time to write an educator's guide to come out alongside this book. So it's actually free and available online. And the guide is designed to bring out a lot of the themes, in the book and help people in book clubs or classroom settings or library settings really talk about it, because I agree that I do think that I think the reality is that for a lot of Black and brown kids in America right now, their lives are being very intimately impacted by gentrification right now. And it's something that's not being talked about. And I think it is, altering their life experiences. It's altering their neighborhoods and their families, and it's worth talking about. So in the educator's guide, there's aspects of, breaking down what gentrification is and how it happens, how it's often the result of deliberate city policies. But then the educator's guide also talks about, it has a curriculum aspect about, ways to resist gentrification, or, there's a section about mutual aid, for example, which is a big theme in the book, talking about how when people know each other, these social safety nets are created and what that means. There's a section on historical cultural movements, like how the Harlem Renaissance was only able to happen because it was low and middle income Black artists who are all living in the same neighborhood, and walks through a bunch of similar movements in the role of space. So yeah, I really hope that this is a book that feels accessible and engaging enough that kids want to read it on their own, but also if a teacher or a parent or a librarian wants to go a little bit deeper, I wanted to make sure that the tools were there for them to do so. So I'm just as proud as the education guide as I am of the book itself in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. Where could someone find the education guide?
So it's online. It would be at my website, which is www.jadeadia.com. But also if you look at the There Goes the Neighborhood book page website on disneybooks.com, which you can find by just typing in the book title and Disney Books, it's going to be available for download there as well. And hopefully maybe in a future edition, it might even be tucked into the back of a book, but we'll see.
Gotcha, yeah. Okay, that'll be nice for parents to be able to find on there.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I wanted to ask you was, sorry.
I know.
Oh, gosh, it's not fun being sick right now. But
Oh, I'm so sorry.
back
I
to
know.
back to business, back to business. So obviously, this must have brought up like a lot of feelings for you when you were a kid seeing this happen to your neighborhood or surrounding neighborhoods. Did you have like an outlet that you could talk to or a book that inspired you, maybe the way that your book might inspire people?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, well, for me, like the difference between my own experience growing up and the difference between what the kids are going through is that when I was growing up, there was like, a small aspect of gentrification, but the scale at which it was happening, it is nowhere near like as extreme as it is for kids today. So that is kind of the core difference where I think for me when I was growing up, these weren't really things that we were talking about because these weren't really things that I remember feeling or experiencing at that point. It honestly was really, I went away for college and I didn't get to come, I went all the way to the East Coast, so I didn't get to come back home a lot during school. But I do remember it was in college when I came back home, for the holidays, and I was looking around, I was like, oh my God, I was like, what's happening? And during those years was when I feel as though like the accelerated gentrification really started to take over my neighborhood where, those 4 years of college, when I would come home once a year for Christmas, every year things felt so different after the neighborhood having felt pretty much the same for a long time before then. So that is a difference between the kids where the characters in this book, they're dealing with the neighborhood now in this fast-paced changing era, whereas things were still, God, I hate to use this phrase because it makes me feel so old, but like things were still kind of the old days when I was there. But, so for me, but there were other things that you deal with as well, like anything that comes from like living in a neighborhood that faces other challenges as well. So for me, I guess growing up reading books that I would turn to, I don't have a specific one in mind. But I did read a lot of mystery books, which maybe is why all of these years later, this book, There Goes Neighborhood has like a mystery plot line in it as well, because I kind of liked how active of a reader you have to be when you're reading a mystery, where you're really searching for clues and doing your own investigative work as a reader. I always found that form of storytelling to be a really good escape that can really turn off the brain. So yeah, deep into the mystery books as a kid.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm deep into the murder mysteries as well, so
Oh yeah.
Are there any authors or books that you read right now that you would say are like inspiring for your work? Or is it still the murder mysteries?
Oh no, definitely. I mean, I'm so happy that there's so many amazing people writing right now. Particularly Black authors. Like one that really comes to mind was Christina Hammonds Reed, who wrote the book The Black Kids. And that was a book that I read it when I was in law school thinking about like if this is something I want to do. Because I was thinking about how when I was growing up, there were very good books that were written by Black authors and had Black characters, of course, but many of those books were historical fiction, where they were set in the civil rights movement or they were set during slavery. And so as a kid reading those books growing up, though that was very important, I felt a little bit like I'm like a nerdy Black girl in South LA watching anime and playing Catan with my friends. Like, I don't really know if I feel seen necessarily in historical fiction in the way that, like, I think I was craving at that time. And I think the amazing thing about YA now is that there are so many more diverse stories, and particularly contemporary stories. So when I read this book, The Black Kids by Christina Hammonds Reed, I had such a strong reaction because I had started writing There Goes the Neighborhood, but as I was writing it, I was like, I don't know if there's a place for this in this industry necessarily. And what I mean by that is that this is a book that's about, like, the main character is very messy and makes a lot of bad choices. She's not the cookie cutter image of, like, you know, what a quote unquote good girl is necessarily. But she also is, you know, like I was, she's like incredibly nerdy and geeky and has those interests, but she also has a lot of anger. And I think to have a character that, you know, wasn't necessarily like the model example of anything, I wasn't sure how the book would land. And then on top of that, it's a dark comedy about gentrification and has a lot of, you know, harsh humor around that. I just wasn't sure if this book would have a place, but reading The Black Kids, which is a book about a girl in LA in the 90s during the Rodney King uprisings. It's so beautifully drawn, so complicated, and the main character really refuses to be put into any boxes. And I think that was one of the first times in a while that I had read such a complicated portrait of Black girlhood. And that really made me feel like, oh, I need to finish my book. I need to get it out there. And I sent the author a crazy DM, honestly, looking back, where I was just like, I just like really admire you so much. I just completely fangirled in her DMs. And another full circle moment, like for my book launch in LA, later this week, she reached out and volunteered to like help host it for me. So I'm actually going to meet her in person for the first time. So another weird, like beautiful full circle moment about this. But years ago, I sent her a fan mail DM, and now she's going to be helping me with my book launch. So that book also feels especially special now.
That is so awesome. That's just a dream come true.
I know, because I really was so embarrassed. I was like, wow, this woman thinks I'm crazy, but she was so nice. And it's funny how things end up working out.
Yeah, that is awesome. One last thing before you go. When like families read this together, what kind of conversations do you hope that they could have while reading it?
Yeah, I think conversations about, some of the broad themes, just about thinking critically about the role of change in all of our lives and how change shapes our relationships with ourselves and with one another. I think that's an important and accessible talking point to really start broaching a lot of these themes, as the book covers changes in the neighborhood, but also changes in a friend group, and changes like within the main character's family and stuff. So yeah, those conversations about change would be a great place to start. And then again, when it comes to gentrification, thinking of this as a people first issue and thinking about the human cost of gentrification and what it means to center the experiences of people on the front lines. And while it is always important to talk about the economic aspects of things, the political aspects of things, to not lose sight of the human heart of a lot of things that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your book really focuses on the human heart as well, which I love.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jordan, and I hope you feel better.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for coming on to today's episode, and we will see you guys tomorrow.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast, and will join us for the next exciting episode. If you want to make sure you don't miss a second of the show, please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. And also be sure to visit readingwithyourkids.com and download your copy of the Reading With Your Kids online magazine. It's free. It's available at readingwithyourkids.com. Just click on our blog. Before we go, I want to make sure that I give a big thank you to my team: Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Madison Dairies, Soji Franklin, Monica Rivera Sosa, Ann O'Leary. I want to give a big thank you to my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me, and most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.